Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope you had a nice Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate around December time-ish. Or if you didn't celebrate anything, I hope you had a nice December. I am back, as you can tell, with another video. And today we're going to be covering a general overview of aphobia and everything that comes with that. Now, like I said, this is going to be a general overview, so while I will be covering a broad range of topics, I won't necessarily be covering these topics in depth. And I think before I've mainly covered things in depth but not very broad, so this time I'm going very broad but not very in depth. I hope that makes sense. But if there is a particular part of this video which you are more interested in seeing covered more in depth and with more research to it, then do let me know, because it might be something that I will do. Before we get started, I just wanted to clarify my use of language in this video. So I'm going to be using, I guess, 3 words to talk about phobia towards aspec people. Aphobia, acephobia, and arophobia. Acephobia and arophobia hopefully are obvious. They are dislike or discrimination towards people who identify as aspec, so asexual or somewhere on the asexual spectrum. And arophobia is people who are somewhere on the aro spectrum, and you're being arophobic towards them. Aphobia, if I say aphobia, not acephobia, then I'm talking about the umbrella term which contains acephobia and arophobia. So discrimination towards people who identify either on the aro spectrum and or the ace spectrum. I hope that makes sense. Just wanted to clarify that before starting. But with that out of the way, let's get started. So my very catchy title of this is the who, what, why, when, and how, or some combination of those question words of aphobia. Now, I'm going to be doing a rough structure about it, talking about what is aphobia, why are people aphobic, how are people aphobic, in what ways are they being aphobic, and why. I hope I covered the words in the right order, but if I didn't, it will be clarified soon. So I did briefly in the preamble talk about what aphobia was. Aphobia is a discrimination towards people who identify on the ace or aro spectrums. Now that's pretty obvious, but I guess the nature of aphobia is something that a lot of people don't understand. It's not as visible and well understood as something like homophobia or transphobia. Part of this is because our issues are more internal than external. For example, with homophobia, a large issue to do with gay rights is gay marriage, and like I talked about just before the holiday, the right to give blood and not be discriminated against for your orientation in that sense. And a similar thing for trans people, things like being able to legally recognize your gender, being able to transition, and being able to go into spaces that conform with your gender. On the other hand, aphobia is more things to do about someone's orientation being disregarded as unreal, as fake, and people harassing or being discriminatory towards those who identify as ace or aro. So while there isn't any grand sweeping changes that need to be made in terms of legislation for the most part to accept ace people, other than, I guess, recognizing them in these LGBT plus events and in these LGBT plus laws, I think the main issue is a lack of understanding, and because there's a lack of understanding and a lack of public consciousness of ace and aro people and of ace and aro issues, there is a lot of discrimination that comes from that misunderstanding. So in terms of how people are aphobic, in my mind there are 2 broad categories of aphobia. The first is unintentional. So this might be people who are well-meaning, and just because they don't understand ace and aro people and the ace and aro spectrum and the identities, they will unintentionally be aphobic. Common phrases that are used while being unintentionally aphobic is, oh, you just haven't met the right person yet, or you'll grow out of it, it's a phase. Although this may seem very innocent and the person may genuinely be trying to help the person they're talking to, it's actually disregarding your identity, and it's reinforcing the fact, which society kind of pushes on you that being asexual or being aromantic is wrong, and there's something wrong with you and you're broken. And that can really be a detriment to someone's mental health, because they're not being accepted by people, and especially the people saying this would normally be the people that are confiding in their friends, their family, and if they're not accepting them, it can be really hurtful. By dismissing someone's orientation as a phase, a medical disorder, or a mental health issue, you are telling them that the way that they feel is inherently wrong and that it needs to be fixed, which in my mind is kind of advocating in some senses for conversion therapy. Because if you're saying, oh yes, you need to fix the way you are, where being asexual and aromantic is perfectly natural, then you're saying, yes, please have conversion therapy for me because you don't conform to my standards. And the second broad category of aphobia is intentional aphobia. So this is people who do understand what asexuality and aromanticism are, do understand the definitions, but don't accept it. This, I guess, is more a parallel to the way homophobia and transphobia are, because a lot of the time people do understand those orientations and those gender identities, but they don't accept it for whatever reason. And what is frustrating about this is the majority of this intentional aphobia, in my experience, comes from within the LGBT plus community. It's people who think that ace and aro people are just straight people who are trying to muscle their way into the LGBT plus community, or they think that their ace and aro people are just people who are celibate and they want a label so they can feel more special, which is obviously not true. An orientation is a very different thing from celibacy or being abstinent, which are choices, and they're perfectly valid choices. If someone wants to be celibate for however long, for whatever reason, whether they may be a religious reason or just for their own health or their own, they just don't want sex in the moment, that's totally fine. But that is a completely different thing from asexuality, which is not choosing to abstain, but just not feeling the sexual attraction in the first place. And the key thing here is that asexuality and not feeling sexual attraction doesn't necessarily discount the possibility of that person wanting to have sex, because there are many reasons to have sex other than just having an inherent drive for it. That could be that you're dating someone who identifies outside of the ace spectrum and you're perfectly fine with having it. It could just be because you enjoy the sensations of it. So there is a very clear distinction between asexuality and just being celibate, and similarly between aromanticism and just being single and choosing to be single. It takes understanding what sexual attraction is and what the orientation is to be able to make that distinction. So that's the majority of the question words done, but I wanted to really focus in on why people are aphobic, because I think this is really important. And I think that by understanding why people are acting that way, why people are discriminating towards those who identify as ace and aro, is a key step in being able to combat that and being able to educate people and being able to destroy the misconceptions that have led to this aphobia. Now, of course, that's not possible to do in its entirety. There will always be people, unfortunately, who for whatever reason are aphobic, for whatever reason are homophobic or transphobic or anything else. But by understanding where they're coming from, hopefully you'll be able to educate them about ace issues and understand why. So I think a big reason, and probably the main reason people are aphobic, is just misunderstanding. In my experience, when people have learned about asexuality and aromanticism, they truly understand it, then they do accept it as an orientation because it makes a lot of sense. If you can accept that people can be attracted to one gender or the other gender, or both genders, or any gender, then you can extrapolate that and say, oh, there's one point missing here, and that's being attracted to no genders. It makes sense. But the problem is that society is so hypersexualized, especially within some groups, like men tend to be more sexual, so I think it's less acceptable for men to identify as asexual, that it's difficult for some people to be able to reconcile being asexual in the world that we live in. And that leads to it, like I mentioned earlier, being conflated with things that are very different to asexuality, like mental health issues and medical issues, which are completely different. And of course, since sex is important to a lot of people in relationships, they can't understand not having that part of a relationship and being happy. And that is fair enough. It is difficult to fully comprehend someone's experience when it's different from your own, and it takes a lot of communication with those people to understand where they're coming from. And since the ace community and the aro communities are so small, it makes it difficult, because you're not going to end up meeting a lot of people relatively who feel that way. And I think that everything that is unknown and is different to you is initially met with confusion, is initially met with fear and mistrust. So I think the key to this is really just educating people. Another thing that I mentioned briefly earlier was that LGBT plus people often think that ace and aro folk are trying to get a special identity so they can be in the LGBT plus community too, which is ridiculous, because asexuals have been represented within the LGBT plus community for as long as it has existed, as far as I know. I'm pretty sure there were mentions of asexuality going back to the Stonewall riots. And also it discounts the fact that there are a lot of queer people within the ace and aro communities. For example, I myself identify as homoromantic asexual, which means that I am romantically attracted to men. Like myself, I am also a man, which means I'm gay. But I would say that I probably identify more as asexual than I do as gay. But I'm not LGBT plus just because I'm homoromantic. I'm LGBT plus because I'm homoromantic, but I'm also LGBT plus because I am asexual. The thing is, the LGBT plus community, in my mind, should be a safe space and a welcoming space for anyone whose gender identity or whose sexual orientation is different from the norm. And the norm is being cis and being romantic heterosexual, if we want to be specific about it. So if you are not all three of those things simultaneously, then you are perfectly welcome and valid within the LGBT plus community as a member of that community. And finally, we get to my very last question. Why is aphobia bad? Now, that might seem obvious to you, but I think that because ace and aro issues maybe aren't as visible as those of other LGBT plus identities, that people don't understand what's the big deal. And I was quite fortunate with the timing I'm putting out this video, because Avon recently retweeted some information from the UK National LGBT Survey from June 2018. And that really makes clear the kind of effect that this discrimination has on ace and aro people. Now, the data is taken for just people who identify as asexual, but I would imagine that the majority of these issues would be equal, if not worse, for aromantic people, just because I feel that the pressure to be romantic in our society is greater than even the pressure to be sexual. So 7.9% of cisgender asexual respondents had been offered conversion therapy, which was over 2% higher than the second highest orientation on the list. Secondly, when the respondents told healthcare professionals of their orientation, the trend was that when you told your healthcare professional about your orientation, your treatment, your level of care improved. And this was true for every single orientation that was queried, except for asexuals. When they came out to healthcare professionals, only 14% said they had a positive effect on their level of care, and 25% said that it had a negative effect. And if that if that doesn't make clear how discriminatory even healthcare professionals can be towards ace people, I don't really know what else to say. Because I think that's just because they don't understand asexuality, and while they're trying to help, they figure that, oh, you've just got a low libido, or there's something that can fix this, because they assume that everyone who isn't interested in sex is distressed in some way, which obviously isn't true. There are tons more facts and information about how asexuality affects your mental health and affects rates of suicide, and people are offered conversion therapy so much more than other orientations. But I will leave that for another video just because I've been talking for a long time. Anyway, I hope this little ramble was valuable. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it gave you a nice, shallow, broad overview of aphobia and the kind of subtopics around that. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I had to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time.